the scripture says that to know to do good and not do it, to that person, that's a sin. And why would that be a sin? I mean, we know that we need to do something that would be right. If we avoid doing it, it is almost the equivalent of disobeying or doing something wrong. In God's view, I believe that he looks at the heart and he takes us as we are, and he expects us to just acknowledge his direction and do what he says. I mentioned to you some time back that my prayer life is not as perhaps verbose as maybe some people would think. And it's not so much that I'm looking at other people's approval of the way I pray. To me, that is of the least importance. The essence of my prayer life is I want to surrender to God. I want to be able to be willing to do what he says and to be obedient. It's like, if I know that I'm supposed to do something and yet I avoid doing it, or I put it off for perhaps a period of time, and there's some practical examples that I can offer in that. But am I truly being obedient? And I become more and more aware, especially in a situation such as prayer. I'll give you just a simple example. And one aspect of it is you meet someone who has a particular need, and the general form of trying to address their need is to say to them, I'll pray for you. Now, I'm not saying that that's not a genuine statement, but I'm saying that in many cases, that is not satisfactory for the need. There may be other things that are going to be required besides just praying, but praying can open the door to our obedience to the other responses. So rather than saying to the individual, I'll pray for you, it's a much easier thing for some to be able to say, can I pray for you now? And in that particular way, you bring that person and their need into the present. You're addressing it as it is important to them. Now, there may be other things that need to be accomplished, other resources that need to be sought, but the first step is to let them know you care, and you care enough to pray for them right now. So that's a part of obedience in its application, where you're confronted with a particular circumstance and you need to be able to address it at that moment. There have been many times that I've had people that have informed me of a health situation or a condition or something that was going on in their life, and they were accustomed to other people responding almost in a sense of, gee, I'm sorry for you, I'll pray for you. When that same type of situation presented itself to me, I had learned and am learning that the time for the prayer was right then. It was the opportunity to have a connection with that individual in a way that God moves because they understand you're doing something that is not necessarily convenient, and it's also not necessarily the thing that they would expect, but it is addressing their need. And so that part is just applying a time frame for obedience. So when is the best time to pray for the needs of others? As soon as we find out that there is a need. And then there's always the continual seeking of God's wisdom in what he wants to accomplish in that situation. So the beginning step is to pray then. The second part is to hear what God says about administering in whatever manner to that need. So I think that is one illustration that we could use. I have another that demonstrates slow obedience being, as we say, no obedience. And I can do this simply on my own experience. It happened rather recently, and I was en route to, believe it or not, a prayer breakfast. And there were going to be many, many people there. It was a church gathering, and it was a group of men in that particular breakfast. And I'm driving down the street on the way to the church, and I passed a homeless man who had a sign that he was hungry and homeless. And I drove past him. Now, of course, he was on the opposite side of the street. It would have been an inconvenience for me to have stopped to be in contact with him. But the justification for it was, I'm going in the other direction and he's on the opposite side of the street. As I'm continuing in that direction, I sense the Lord saying to me, stop and go back to this homeless man. And I didn't do it. I continued driving. The word came much more intensified, stop and go back. So within the next few moments, I stopped, I turned around, I drove the car back in the other direction. I parked in the parking lot that was adjacent to where he was. I left my vehicle and I walked over to him and I asked him, I said, are you hungry? And he said, yes. And I said, well, come and go with me and we'll get you fed. And quickly he picked up, he had a little bucket that he was sitting on. He picked up this little bucket and he put it in the back of my vehicle and he got inside and we drove to the prayer breakfast and I introduced him to all the people that were there, probably 100 plus people. And it was an interesting thing. Had I not stopped, I may not have had the opportunity to reach out to this particular homeless individual. But it showed me something. What it did show me was that I could have gone on ahead and just continued with my plan, which would have been to go to the prayer breakfast. But that would not have been obedient to what the Lord wanted. He wanted that man to be shown compassion and acceptance. Here he was, when he came into that particular group, nobody knew that he was homeless, and nobody knew that he had other needs. But he was there, and we could show him care and compassion. And that has progressed so that we can see, as I had mentioned earlier, there was a time to address the need, and then God could reveal more of what he wanted to do. But the question is, what if I didn't go back? I would have been disobedient. God was merciful in stopping me and telling me to go back, but I could have continued on. I could have arrived at the prayer breakfast, participated in all of the function and everything, but I would have been very guilty and very disobedient. I would have had to have asked the Lord for forgiveness, because there was a situation that we talked about earlier, and that was to know to do good and not do it. To that person, it's sin. And for me, I knew that I had to do something. I didn't know what it was, but I had to reach out to this individual and show him the love and compassion of God. And so thankfully, God was gracious and merciful and allowed me to experience that. But there have been times that I have actually passed somebody in a similar situation and have gone well past that distance and then felt convicted of it, turned around, and they weren't there anymore. So I missed that opportunity. And I don't want to be in a process of missing opportunities to be obedient to God.
Wow, Richard. That's beautiful. I want to ask you, so he didn't know when he was getting in the car that you were a pastor or that you were taking him to a prayer breakfast, the way that you just related it. You took him there, 100 people, and when he got there, what was his reaction? Did he stay the whole time?
Yes, he did, because I actually was his ride back. But I think more importantly, he was able to participate with the other men, and there was no difference. I mean, they may have had homes or apartments or whatever to live in, and he didn't. But he was still a man. He had the same needs that we all have. And the greatest need was that to know that he was accepted, to know that God had not just set him aside, regardless of what his life circumstance might have been. He needed to know that God truly cared for him. And I think that to a great degree that was achieved. Nobody was so concerned and it was not something that was broadcast that he was homeless. It was shared at our particular table. And we had a man that was there that actually works with homeless people and was willing to help him, extended himself to him. And that brings about yet another part of the topic, and that's the response of the people that we extend ourselves to in obedience to God. They don't always respond in the way that we think they should. And sometimes it's disappointing, but we still have to be obedient.
Richard, when you were relating that story just now, I've never been homeless to where I just didn't have a place that I could go. But I have been blessed in my life with friends allowing me to stay with them from time to time. And you brought me back in my mind just now. When I was in Richmond, I went to VCU. I dropped out of Old Dominion University back in 1971, I think it was. And I went to Richmond and I transferred after a semester. I sat out. But I had a couple friends that let me stay with them for 3 weeks one time. I mean, it's not the first time. I've stayed with friends a couple times in my life. And I've actually come and stayed on my mother's couch when I dropped out of the college the second time for about 3 months. I stayed at my mother's house. I mean, I actually had a bed, but I came back and camped out at my mom's. I've been taken in a lot of times by a lot of people and shown the love that you're talking about. And I can never forget it. And just talking to you right now, and I think it's demonstrating to the listeners why I said what I said about you, being so close to Don and I, and that you're such a discerning, godly man. And that's why I've asked you to participate on this show today. There was one example when I was in my Richmond years, and my mother just about, she told me once, Stevie, I got 4 kids, and you're the only one that put all these gray hairs on my head. The others didn't put one of these gray hairs. They're all from you. And I said, oh, you honor me, Mom. Thank you. No, I'm just joking there. But the point was, I was working as the accountant bookkeeper while I was in college for a drapery company, a small manufacturing workshop, sweat house, they called it. Interior decorators, and they had 12 people in there that would make draperies and slipcovers and things. And they got into tremendous trouble with the Internal Revenue Service. And the Internal Revenue Service came in and padlocked, chained their doors shut. And I'm only saying this maybe because I do financial consulting and I just want people to know a little bit about my background. I'm not a straightforward financial conventional consultant.